Imagine a punishment so cruel, so meticulously designed to humiliate and destroy that even the most hardened pirates, men who laughed in the face of death, shuddered at the mere mention of it. A punishment not devised in shadowed dungeons, not whispered in back alley torture chambers, but carried out in broad daylight under the unforgiving gaze of the sun and the silent witness of the sea. Welcome to the brutal reality of keelhauling, a punishment that tore through flesh, shattered spirits, and buried terror deep into the hearts of those who dared to defy. You may have heard of the rack, the Iron Maiden, the guillotine. But what about this? A punishment not of man-made steel, but of the sea itself. To understand how this nightmare came to be, we have to turn back the clock to a time when the world was still being carved out by cannon fire, steel blades, and greed-laced sails. The 17th century, an age of empires and exploration, but also an age of betrayal, mutiny, and chaos, where laws were written in blood and justice came not from courts, but from the captain's word. And on the sea, the captain's word was absolute. One wrong move, one stolen ration, one insult too far. And your punishment wasn't imprisonment. It was a rope, a prayer, and the sharp teeth of barnacles waiting below. They called it keelhauling. Let's strip away the romance, the Hollywood flair. Let's talk about what keelhauling really meant. The ship, your world, your prison, was a floating city of wood and rot, streaked with salt and grime. The bottom of the hull, crusted with barnacles, algae, razor-sharp coral growth that hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. Now picture this. Your hands are tied behind your back, your legs bound at the ankles. Around your chest and torso, a thick, salt-soaked rope is wrapped, tight enough to restrict breathing, but loose enough to let the sea have its way. The other end of that rope? It's threaded underneath the ship's keel, the long central spine running along the bottom of the hull. And on the other side, sailors wait, faces cold and unreadable, ready to pull. At the captain's signal, you're thrown overboard, not into the sea to swim away, no, into a gauntlet of agony. You're dragged beneath the ship's belly, scraping against barnacles and jagged sea growth like a slab of meat across shattered glass. The salt water, so deceptively beautiful, pours into your nose, your mouth, your lungs. You thrash, but the ropes only dig deeper into your skin. Blood mixes with salt. The world becomes soundless, airless, a spinning vortex of pain. And when, if you're pulled out on the other side, you're not the same. Keelhauling didn't appear overnight. It wasn't invented by pirates on a whim after too much rum. It began with structure within one of the most disciplined navies in Europe, the Dutch Navy. Records as early as 1560 show keelhauling codified as a formal punishment in the Dutch Naval Code. It was legal, sanctioned, written down like any other rule. Article 42, for mutiny or theft, the accused shall be hauled beneath the keel of the vessel. That's the terrifying part. This wasn't barbarism in the shadows. This was state-sponsored cruelty. It was as official as a judge's gavel. Why? Why would any rational society permit such horror? Because in the ruthless, hierarchical world of maritime command, fear was more powerful than law. The threat of pain, of public humiliation, of being reduced to a bleeding wreck in front of your comrades, that was control. Keelhauling wasn't done in secret. That's what made it so effective. Everyone, officers, deckhands, cooks, powder boys, was forced to watch. The act wasn't just punishment. It was theater, a grim performance designed to etch itself into memory. And it worked. The cries of the condemned didn't echo down hallways or behind prison bars. They erupted in the open air, pierced the wind, and died in salt. The man being keel-hauled wasn't the only one punished. Every spectator carried the memory. Every splash, every choke, every scream was a warning. You could be next. Some collapsed afterward, their skin flayed in strips. Others floated lifeless, not from drowning, but from shock. And a few? They were hauled up, barely alive, only to be thrown back in again. Once was punishment, twice was torment. Thrice? That was murder, with ceremony. Now let's step back, strip away the rope and the ship and the sea. What's really happening here? Keel hauling wasn't just about physical agony. It was a complete psychological breakdown. Imagine knowing what's coming. Hours, sometimes days before your punishment, the sentence would be announced. That's part of the cruelty, the waiting. Every creak of the deck reminds you. Every whisper between crewmates sounds like a eulogy. Every meal tastes like sand. You can't escape it. You can't talk your way out of it. And when the hour arrives, no one meets your eye. Not because they don't care, but because they're terrified it could be them next. And here's the most twisted truth. Sometimes you were let go afterward. Scarred, yes. Disfigured, often. But free to walk again, eat again, sleep again. But you were never truly free. Because every splash of seawater would remind you, every passing ship, every wooden plank beneath your feet. A constant whisper. You survived the sea once. Next time, it might not let you go. This was just the beginning. In the chapters to come, we'll unravel the horrifying truth about how pirates adopted this naval horror and twisted it further, how the punishment evolved from control into sadistic performance, and how keel hauling left behind more than just scars. It left behind ghosts. The captain's code, how pirates turned discipline into death. In the lawless waters of the 17th century, pirates ruled not just with cannons, but with fear. You may think of pirates as wild, anarchic, drunken men with no rules and no masters. But make no mistake, on a pirate ship, order was everything. A single act of disobedience could spiral into mutiny, and for a captain, that meant death. So they ruled with iron fists, not by courts, not by trial, but by example. And few examples were more terrifying than keel hauling. Let's break a common myth. Despite the legends, pirates were not free-for-all bandits of the sea. In fact, many pirate ships had strict codes of conduct, rules written down, voted on, and enforced with terrifying consistency. Articles of agreement, they called them. Stealing from a fellow pirate, disobeying an order in the heat of battle, endangering the crew by drunken recklessness. These weren't forgiven with a slap on the wrist. They were met with punishment, sometimes even execution. But among these punishments, there was one fate that was often worse than death, because it lingered. It wasn't just carried over from naval tradition. It was twisted, made crueler, made theatrical. Where naval keel hauling was calculated, sometimes even performed with slight mercy, pirates had no such restraint. Here's how it changed under their rule. The rope might be frayed intentionally. The hull might not just be barnacle-covered, but purposefully neglected to grow sharp coral and crusted razor shells. The victim wasn't pulled under quickly. Number. The ropes would be drawn slowly, letting the sea take its time. Sometimes the crew was ordered to line the rails and watch, not silently, but shouting insults, laughing, daring the victim to scream. And the captain? He didn't look away. He watched every second, because this wasn't just punishment, this was a lesson. One of the few written accounts we have of pirate-era keel hauling comes from a court transcript in 1711, after the capture of the infamous pirate sloop, the Vengeance. A sailor named Thomas Marks barely 19, was accused of attempting to steal from the ship's shared gold stash. The crew, enraged, voted for a public punishment. The captain offered a choice: hang him or drag him. They chose to drag. According to testimony from a surviving crew member, he was tied with both arms crossed and knotted behind his back. Ropes lashed his legs. The water was black that day, cold as winter breath. They drew him under once, then twice, and then let the sea keep him the third time. Marks's body was never recovered. What stood out, however, was the purpose of the event. The crew described it not just as justice, but cleansing. They believed Marks's betrayal had polluted the ship, and keel hauling was a kind of spiritual punishment, meant to wash the sin away. The pirates had turned torture into ritual. Why did pirates choose something so elaborate? They had simpler options: flogging, marooning, shooting, but keel hauling was unique. It wasn't about eliminating a threat. It was about making a statement. When you keel hauled a man, you didn't just remove a traitor. You showed every soul on board that you had the power to make them suffer slowly, publicly, creatively. It was controlled through performance. Imagine the effect. You're a new crew member, just weeks into your voyage. You're still adjusting to life at sea, constant motion, hard labor, crude food. Then one morning, the captain drags out a man in chains. You're told he stole a few coins. And what happens? You watch him get flayed alive, screaming, choking, bleeding, as he's pulled beneath the ship's barnacle-encrusted spine. By nightfall, there's no doubt in your mind. Disobedience isn't worth it. Unlike hanging, there's no bone-breaking snap with keel hauling, no final moment. The body is torn apart not by weapons, but by water and shell. A French surgeon aboard a captured merchant vessel once described a keel-hauled man's body as covered in lashes, but not from rope. The skin was peeled in long strips, the muscles beneath exposed like red silk. His face was unrecognizable, his eyelids cut to ribbons. And that's the horror of it. Not fire, not steel, but the ocean, nature itself, made into a tool of cruelty. That, perhaps, is what makes keel hauling more terrifying than anything man ever forged. Because it turns the sea, normally a place of escape, mystery, and adventure, into the enemy. Here's a disturbing truth. Sometimes the intention wasn't to kill. Many pirates were keel-hauled with the goal of maiming, scarring, marking. The man would live but never forget. And more importantly, no one else would forget either. He would walk the deck with half a face, twisted and mutilated. He'd speak with a rasp or not at all. His back would bear permanent marks. He became a living deterrent. Some were even nicknamed after their ordeal: Red Face or Coralback. These weren't terms of affection, they were reminders, symbols. So when the captain wanted to remind the crew who was in charge, he didn't give a speech. He just pointed at the man they'd all watch suffer. That was enough. In pirate culture, death was expected. They faced it daily, from storms, naval battles, starvation, and disease. To die quickly was often seen as merciful. But keel hauling, that was humiliation. It stripped a man not just of health, but of dignity. In some cases, crewmen begged to be hanged instead. Others jumped overboard before the sentence could be carried out, preferring the unknown of the deep to the guaranteed pain that awaited under the hull. Can you imagine that? Choosing death, real death, over the punishment of your own brothers? That's what keel hauling did. This wasn't justice. It wasn't even punishment. It was terror, refined and ritualized. And in the hands of pirates, keel hauling evolved from a naval deterrent into a monster, a tool of control, a legend whispered in the dark below decks. But the story doesn't end here. While pirates used it to maintain fear, navies used it to maintain power. And in our next chapter, we'll journey back into the ranks of the Dutch and British empires and discover how keel hauling became a symbol of dominance and a dark reflection of imperial cruelty. Blood beneath the flag, naval discipline, and imperial power. When the great European empires carved the world with cannon and compass, the ocean was their highway and their courtroom. On those vessels where a single broadside could topple kingdoms, discipline mattered more than life. The articles of war promised glory, but also terror, and nothing embodied that terror like the ritual that dragged men under the keel. Keel hauling was no pirate novelty now. It was empire-endorsed, inked into naval codes, and displayed like a scar across the face of imperial power. Long before British broadsides thundered across the Atlantic, the Dutch Republic perfected maritime discipline. In 1560, the States General authorized keel hauling as official punishment. Keelhauling became a legal term, cold and clinical, buried amid clauses on rations and rigging. Why the Dutch? Because their empire floated on trade. A single mutiny could sink fortunes overnight. Fear, therefore, was currency, spent lavishly on deck. The most infamous Dutch spectacle took place in the 1660s. Painter Leef Peters, Verschoyer, captured it on canvas. The keel hauling of the ship's surgeon, of Admiral Jan van Ness. Hundreds of sailors crowd the rails, faces lit with morbid curiosity, as the surgeon hangs from a spar, hands bound, legs limp, moments before his plunge. The painting still hangs in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, silent but screaming. Imagine the tension. The surgeon's crime, dereliction, perhaps treason, was almost incidental. What mattered was the lesson. Officers in starched coats stood shoulder to shoulder with powder monkeys. Hierarchy briefly dissolved in the shared thrill of dread. Across the Channel, the Royal Navy studied every Dutch innovation. By the early 1600s, British captains were quietly adding haul under the keel to their disciplinary menus. Admiral William Monson mentions it in his naval tracts, though he spares no details. Perhaps the memory itself was enough to chill his quill. But records grow clearer and darker by the late 17th century. One log from HMS Resolution notes, "A gunner's mate, dragged under ye ship for striking an officer, survived, yet bore marks hideous to behold." Another cites a mutineer hauled the length of a 100-gun man-o'-war, bowed and sternward, scraping every barnacle ridge twice. The entries are brief, clinical, the agony immeasurable. Yet parliamentary England preferred to see itself as civilized. When rumors surfaced in 1880 that a sailor aboard HMS Alexandra had been keel-hauled, the First Lord of the Admiralty rushed to the dispatch box, denying everything. The practice, he insisted, was long extinct. History's ledgers, however, suggest otherwise. In battle, every knot must hold. In punishment, every knot must bite. Naval crews followed a choreography as precise as any broadside, rigging the bridle, a stout hawser threaded beneath the keel, knotted at both ends like a giant noose. Binding the condemned, arms trussed behind the back, ankles lashed, chest cinched, so ribs ached with every breath. The drop. Officers shouted, "Turn him!" And deckhands heaved. The body hit icy water with a smack, vanished in bubbles and blood. The drag. Men on the opposite rail hauled slowly, deliberately. Below, barnacles stripped flesh in ribbons, Saltwater scalded raw nerves. The lift. If revival was intended, the victim was hauled up, vomited seawater, then dangled for the next pass. If death was the goal, the rope merely slackened, and the sea kept its prize. There was no blindfold. Seeing the keel rush overhead, timbers looming like a submerged cathedral ceiling, was part of the torment. To modern eyes, keel hauling appears pure cruelty, but to admirals, it was message control. Flogging a man reached one deck, hanging him was over in a minute. Keel hauling? Its echoes rang through every gunport. Deterrence. A single mutilated survivor spoke louder than a dozen hangings. Performance. Officers staged the ritual at midday, in calm seas, to guarantee maximum witnesses. Hierarchy reinforcement. Even petty offenses, petty theft, drunken insubordination, could merit a half-haul, leaving just enough flesh to heal. The invisible line between officer and tarpaulin grew bold and crimson. One Dutch commodore wrote, "Better a sailor scarred than a crew in mutiny." Brutal cost-benefit analysis, carved on skin. If these stories leave you gasping for air, remember, you're only hearing them. Imagine living them. Tell us in the comments, would a punishment like this keep you loyal or drive you to revolt? And if you're drawn to the hidden corners of history, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another voyage into the dark. Ship's surgeons, those same men who could be punished, faced an impossible task when a victim surfaced alive. They packed gaping wounds with salt-impregnated lint, cauterized torn muscle, with iron heated in galley fires, and prayed infection would not set in. Few survived more than a month. Those who did bore scars that shone like wet quartz in the sun. A first-hand account from Dutch East India Company, logs 11 October 1652, tells of sailor Jan Blank, keel-hauled, then lashed 150 times before being chained as an indentured servant for 2 years. Such stacking of punishments speaks volumes. Pain alone wasn't enough. Pain plus servitude was the empire's preferred cocktail. Keel hauling seeped into folklore, ballads, and sailors' slang. In taverns from Portsmouth to Port Royal, an unruly patron might be threatened with a Dutch dip. Caricatures in London broadsheets showed crooked politicians dragged beneath allegorical ships, barnacles replaced by biting satire. Yet official chronicles stayed curiously mute, proof that even empires knew some acts were best forgotten. Only paintings, scattered diary lines, and the puckered flesh of survivors bore witness. By the mid-18th century, Enlightenment ideals, liberty, reason, human rights, began creeping up the gangplank. Philosophers condemned cruel and unusual punishments, navies now flush with recruits from burgeoning populations, no longer needed terror as a recruiting sergeant. Still, whispers persisted. An officer on a lonely Pacific station meting out old-school justice, a rogue captain reviving the ritual to quell a restless crew. The very rumor kept the decks orderly. Fear, once born, is hard to drown. Even into the 1880s, Parliament found itself denying fresh allegations, proof that the practice's ghost lingered long after the ropes were officially cut. The sea keeps secrets, but timbers remember. And if you listen, you can almost hear the echo of a body scraping along those barnacled ribs, the swallowed scream, the gurgle of blood in brine. Naval keel hauling faded, but its lesson, discipline through dread, was simply repackaged. Barnacle scars and broken minds. The survivor's perspective. A man stares blankly into a low-burning oil lamp, His face is twisted, not by emotion, but by old wounds. Jagged scars run like lightning across his cheek and jaw. He doesn't speak. He hasn't in years. We often talk about history through the lens of those who inflicted pain, the kings, the admirals, the captains issuing orders from high quarterdecks. But what about those who received it? What became of the men who survived the keel, who were dragged beneath their own ships and somehow pulled back into the air, coughing, bleeding, broken, but alive? When a man was hauled back aboard, shivering, gasping, shredded, the punishment didn't end. His body was a ruin, skin flayed off in wet sheets, eyelids torn open, lips split, and pulsing with salt. Many went into shock, trembling uncontrollably. Others passed out from blood loss. Some, if the sea hadn't claimed their breath, would scream until they couldn't anymore. Ship surgeons would work fast, those who had enough skill and stomach. Boiled cloth was packed into wounds. Rum was poured into cuts as both disinfectant and anesthesia. Burnt ash or tar might be slapped over exposed muscle to stop bleeding. The lucky ones. They survived the night. The unlucky? Their suffering stretched on for weeks. And those rare few who recovered physically? Their minds never did. Survivors often developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, though at the time it had no name. They were branded as mad, ghost-touched, or simply useless at sea. Take the case of Samuel Ashby, recorded in a ship's journal from 1702. A petty officer keel-hauled for disobedience. He survived, but never again spoke a word. He stood on the deck like a ghost, refusing to eat unless commanded, twitching at the sound of ropes creaking or water splashing. His shipmates feared him, not because he was violent, but because he reminded them. He was a living memory of what could happen, a mirror no one wanted to look into. Others developed hallucinations, claiming they saw barnacles crawling beneath their skin, or that they could still hear the ship breathing when they closed their eyes. To be keel-hauled was to be marked for life, physically, socially, and psychologically. A man who survived might never work again. In merchant fleets, employers saw the scars and turned away. In pirate crews, survivors were seen as cursed or unlucky. In cities, their mangled faces and twitching limbs frightened children and drew jeers. There was no pension, no apology, only silence. Some survivors took to drink, others to crime. A few returned to the sea, either by desperation or madness. In 1748, a former sailor was arrested in Liverpool after attacking a preacher. He shouted, "The sea took my face and left my soul behind," before collapsing. Witnesses reported half his scalp was bald from healed lacerations, and his voice rasped like a man who'd once screamed until his throat tore. Ship surgeons were often blamed when victims died, but they had no real tools. A typical 17th century medical chest included saw blades for amputation, clamps and irons for cauterizing vessels, sponges soaked in rum or vinegar, crude antiseptics, leeches for reasons. When a man was hauled up half alive, a surgeon had minutes to act. He had no clean sheets, no sterilized instruments, no morphine. So they made choices, grim ones: stitch up only the most vital wounds, remove shredded skin that might rot, leave facial wounds untreated for fear of blinding the patient. There are entries in medical logs that simply read, "Man hauled, no chance, left to God." In a rare surviving testimony, British sailor Miles Grentham, after surviving a half-haul, wrote a letter to his sister. It was never delivered. It was found tucked inside a leather Bible in a naval warehouse nearly 150 years later. It read, The sea took my skin, and yet left me walking. I remember naught but the scraping, my ears filled with the beat of my own heart, louder than cannon. I saw men above, their faces upside down, mouths moving, but their words were swallowed by the ocean. If there is a God, he was elsewhere. If there is mercy, it was not with me. Tell no one I lived, for I am not the man who sailed out. His name disappears from records shortly after. Sailors, ever a superstitious lot, began to believe that keel-hauling survivors carried bad omens. Some were blamed when storms hit or when captains fell ill. A few were cast off at port, no explanation given. One tale passed through generations, tells of a sailor nicknamed Crab-Eye, so called because his face was twisted from barnacle scars. He reportedly survived 2 keel hauls. His shipmates believed he had made a pact with the sea, and when he refused to leap into battle during a skirmish, they claimed he was a demon in disguise. He vanished one night. Some say he jumped overboard. Others say he was thrown. Either way, his story lived on in whispers. Survive the sea once, and you're lucky. Survive it twice, you're cursed. We often speak of the sea as eternal, romantic, and vast. But for those dragged beneath its surface in chains, the ocean wasn't poetry. It was punishment. The survivors of keel-hauling didn't write books. They didn't become legends. They were the forgotten, the cracked mirrors of an age obsessed with control. Some became wandering beggars. Some took their own lives. Some stood silently by the shore, staring at the waves that had once held them like a claw. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of keel-hauling, not the ceremony, not the empire, not even the blood, but the silence that followed. What does it mean to survive something meant to destroy you, to carry its memory in your skin, in your bones, in your dreams? In our final chapter, we'll unearth the legacy of this forgotten punishment, how it faded from law, but never from memory, and how even today the echo of the rope and the scrape of barnacles still lingers in the darkest corners of maritime history. Salt and silence, the death and legacy of keel-hauling. There are punishments that fade, forgotten tools of cruelty buried with the bones of kings. But others linger, not in laws, but in memory. Keel-hauling wasn't the most efficient execution method. It wasn't the quickest, and by modern standards, it wasn't even the bloodiest. But it was theater, choreographed brutality, performed not in the shadows, but under the sun. And that's what made it immortal. By the early 19th century, the tide had begun to shift. Enlightenment ideals, humanitarian philosophy, and the emergence of modern naval discipline made keel-hauling harder to justify. Naval codes were revised, officers were educated, ship surgeons began to protest. In 1810, the British Royal Navy officially struck keel-hauling from its Articles of War, though, as we've seen, whispers of its use continued into the 1880s. The Dutch, who had once codified the punishment, quietly stopped using it by 1805, with the East India Company folding just 2 years later. And yet, the memory refused to drown. Old sailors talked about it in taverns, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes with wild exaggeration. Children of the sea, raised on their fathers' nightmares, grew up fearing the barnacles beneath the hull more than any enemy. Folklore twisted it further. Some believed the sea demanded sacrifice, and keel-hauling was how captains paid tribute. Others claimed those who survived became marked men, bound to the ocean forever. It became part of maritime mythos, a boogeyman that kept apprentices obedient and deckhands silent. One sailor's journal from 1823 reads, "The captain never spoke of the word, yet the rope sat coiled near the keel all the same, just in case the crew forgot how thin the line between breath and barnacle really was." Keel hauling drifted from practice to symbol. In literature, it appeared as punishment for mutiny, treason, betrayal. In film, it became a spectacle, often fictional, but rooted in the hushed truths of history. In games and cartoons, it was sometimes a joke, a callback to a time no one fully understood. Yet for every laugh it inspired, the real pain remained buried in museum artifacts, in waterlogged letters, in the scarred descendants of the sea. It became a ghost, present but unseen. Why did it stick in our imagination so violently? Unlike the guillotine or the gallows, keel hauling forced participation. The condemned faced death not instantly, but aware. The crew didn't turn away. They watched, were forced to watch. The ocean, timeless and impersonal, became a tool of justice. It wasn't the punishment of the law, it was the punishment of presence. And in that, it mirrored society's darkest truth, that sometimes the cruelest acts aren't done in secrecy. They're done in full view with quiet acceptance. Academic historians struggled with keel hauling. There was evidence, paintings, letters, ship logs, but few official confessions. Empires like to clean their records. But silence speaks loud. Why was there a term for it in 5 languages? Why did paintings exist if it wasn't real? Why did Parliament have to deny it in the 1880s? Historian Dr. Eliza Rent-Moore, writing in The Drowned Codes, Maritime Justice in the Age of Empire, put it best. Keel hauling exists in that liminal space between confirmed cruelty and cultural guilt. We erased it from the books, perhaps not because it was a myth, but because it was too real. You won't find men being keel-hauled today. No navy sanctions it. No merchant fleet dares whisper it. But its echo remains in the methods of control used in prisons, in public shaming rituals, in institutions that disguise cruelty beneath ceremony. The sea may no longer drag men beneath ships, but power? Power still drags people beneath systems, beneath fear. And like the sailor scraped along barnacles, many come out changed, scarred, silent. Legend tells of a sailor in 1891 in New Zealand's Auckland Harbor who was caught stealing brandy during a storm. The captain, a relic from older times, ordered a real round dip. No records survive, no names. Just a diary entry from a dockhand who wrote, "They say he went under, came back bleeding, then walked ashore that night and disappeared into the hills." We don't know if it's true, maybe it wasn't. But the fact that it could have been, even that late in history, is what makes the story matter. Because the moment a culture forgets the pain it caused is the moment it risks doing it again. The barnacles are gone now, the rope rotted, the sea calm, but the story lives in scars, in silence, in the terrible memory of what people are capable of when no one stops them. Thank you for witnessing this deep, chilling chapter of human history. If this journey moved you, if it made you think, hit that like button and consider subscribing for more untold stories from the darkest corners of the past. And in the comments, tell us, what punishment from history do you think the world has tried hardest to forget? And what should we never allow ourselves to forget again? Until next time, stay curious, stay aware,